If you are so inclined, but thought it might be nice instead of just staring onto like little black boxes, blank boxes with names. Okay, cool. We've got a few different things on the agenda today. So I'm just gonna go through them really quick and then we'll have folks talk about them. First, we've got the most recent ServiceMeshHub release. So we can kind of, some folks from the solo team can go over that. There is upcoming open service mesh support. That's the new service mesh that the Microsoft open source team announced. And then in flight, we have AWS account registration. And Mihai, you added a topic here about the limited trust configuration. So we'll go through all of those. And if other things come up, folks, just please add them on there and then we can keep going down the list. So who wants, from the solo team, who wants to go over the release?
Sure, I can drive that. And Scott and Harvey and anybody else can chime in with some additional details to highlight. But yeah, so we've been talking about an ongoing refactor in ServiceMeshHub for the last few community meetings, and that landed at the end of last week. There's some breaking changes to take note of, some like API renames from mesh service to traffic target, mesh workload to workload, access control policy to access policy, just to be a little bit more concise about what objects ServiceMeshHub is operating on. In addition to that, we have added support for Istio 1.7. We have added support for multi-cluster subset routing in Istio, and just in general built a more extensible base for adding features to ServiceMeshHub over time. Scott, do you want to add anything I may have glossed over?
Yeah, so I can just go over a little bit. We went through like a major cleanup of the code inside of the repository. So anyone who's looked at the code or is interested in contributing should be able to find a much more consistently structured project. And it should be, I mean, I would like us to publish some development guides on like different extension areas in ServiceMeshHub, where are the places to do what, as well as I know we're going to be publishing an architecture doc that goes over more how the new system is working. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But yeah, there's basically, as far as the APIs themselves, they haven't changed too dramatically, just kind of cleaning them up for consistency's sake. And I think we still might have some API changes coming in the next few, somewhere along the line. I'm not sure if we tag this current release as a pre-release, but I was hoping that, you know, we could potentially reserve the right to do a few more breaks if necessary, although I don't think we will need to break any user-facing APIs. We may break some of our internal APIs like discovery. But I think we're in a very good place now to start iterating and taking on some of the more complex features.
There have been some renames of the APIs, right?
Yes, we renamed mesh service to traffic target. Another one of the key points is that the ServiceMeshHub API that's facing users, so like traffic policies, for example, are no longer centered around our discovery objects. Users are not required to know like the name of an internal object that's generated from ServiceMeshHub discovery. So if you want to create a traffic policy that applies to a service, you will just select it by the service name. You know, if you've created a Kubernetes service and you want to select that for a policy, you'll just select that directly rather than having to know the names of the discovered resources that ServiceMeshHub generates. That's one example of the ways that our APIs have changed. They've really just been brought to be simplified and a cleaner user experience. So users of ServiceMeshHub should only have to deal with the concepts that they're familiar with. So if you've installed a resource to Kubernetes and then you want to reference it, you should be able to directly reference that from your ServiceMeshHub CRD without having to know the internal processing and discovery mechanisms that ServiceMeshHub uses.
So maybe you could, so I have a question, maybe you could spend a second to explain how does that look as we evolve to support more than just Kubernetes?
Basically wherever appropriate. Like for example, Harvey just took care of, for traffic split, we want to be able to traffic split, shift your traffic between different destinations. In that spec, there's a selector to select what you're going to shift to. And originally it was just Kubernetes service. You would specify the service. Internally, we would map it back to the discovered traffic target. Now we also support a failover service, which is another user created object. So the users, basically we have a one of, and you can extend that one of. And in any appropriate place where, it can either be a kube service or a failover service or something like a service entry, we'll provide extension points where appropriate. We've also talked about allowing users to directly reference mesh services if they feel comfortable sort of digging into the internals of ServiceMeshHub. But I think one of the lessons from Glue was that forcing that on the user or making that the first-class citizen is problematic because users then will either have to understand the internals of discovery or they may need to manually create discovered resources. And I think that we want to avoid that. Is not a great experience.
Okay, that sounds good. Now we did cut a release of that refactored code. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, I think so.
And there have been some, at least momentary, differences in that features that are supported by that code versus what was supported in 061. Joe or Scott, somebody, do you want to say anything
I
about
believe
that?
in terms of Istio, we have feature parity, and in fact, we have more features supported now on Istio than we did before. We have temporarily cut support for the other meshes, which was very limited originally. And we're going to be working on, our next stop is app mesh. We're going to be restoring functionality to app mesh. And we've got OSM, I guess, slated for our next release, or did we release with OSM support, Joe?
That will be the next release, or a release this week.
Yeah. Knock on wood.
Okay, that sounds good, especially the app mesh stuff.
So one question on the service piece that you just talked about, Scott, is that, I wasn't clear, is that all, was some of what you said planned, or is all what you said part of the release? And then is it what kind of documentation? Is the documentation just in the code itself, or is there other documentation that we can look at for some more details? Because as you know, we were interested in a more flexible service discovery, workload discovery mechanism. So we're very interested in kind of seeing what you did there or understanding what you plan to do if it's still in the plan.
Sure. So everything that I just said, except for the app mesh, is available in the current release. I believe our docs have been updated to reflect, basically ported over to support all of the refactors, and I think we've documented the extra functionality that we've added. As far as documenting how to extend the service discovery, we did not originally have, like, this is more what I would consider developer documentation, or maybe like advanced operation. There would have to be some work there. Like we should basically talk about what it actually means and get into the details of what you guys want to do, and figure out the way we can best support that. But definitely, we'll want to have that documented, whether it means changes to the code, or another proposal I would put is that we find a way to have a generic CRD that can be used for generic service discovery. And that way we won't have to always extend the code itself and create new APIs to support specific backends. You'll be able to leverage, I don't know if you guys are familiar with external DNS, the external DNS project.
Yeah, actually, I'm very familiar with it. Yes.
Yeah, so you know, in external DNS, they have this, you can choose the provider for the DNS info, and it can come from what they call the CRD provider, which is just a generic CRD that as long as your operator provides that CRD, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. You know, you can just furnish the information that external DNS needs. So I would consider a similar approach as a possibility for ServiceMeshHub to make it easier to extend without needing to actually, you know, develop and modify the source code.
So, you know, that might be an area that we could even help with. We use external DNS exactly that way for some of the exact use case that we described to you previously. So we're very familiar with that external DNS. We're very familiar with the sources. We've contemplated even, you know, seeing if we could add maybe our own internal source, but we never really pursued it that far. But what you said makes perfect sense to us, and we're very familiar with that.
Right.
Okay, well, we'll look for some of the documentation. So we'll look at the code base for some of the changes you mentioned with respect to these extensions, and then we can circle back or put some questions on Slack if it's not coming out clearly.
Yeah.
We understand the developer documentation problem a little bit, so I understand there might be more source code than great documentation for some of the internal stuff.
So one thing that I'll say, there's actually a couple of videos that we recorded where I walked through with the team as they were on. We expanded the size of the team that's working on ServiceMeshHub, and there was some onboarding. And so I actually recorded that, which is a walkthrough discovery and networking from a high level, but going through the actual code. And we can share that with you, make sure that's in the doc, and that might be very useful as well.
Oh yeah, that sounds like it would really be great if it's something that can be public. That send us some kind of pointer or put it on Slack or whatever way works for sharing it would be wonderful.
Yeah, we can definitely make sure to get that to you.
Cool. So should we move down to the next item? What is that? The OSM support?
Yeah, sure. Not a ton more to say there on OSM support, other than we'll be bringing it in the next release. You know, OSM is largely built on the SMI APIs, and we've added translation support so that we can do some basic traffic policy on top of OSM.
So it'll support discovery and traffic.
Yep.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
Sorry. Yeah, there's an issue link there, and that is also in turn linked to the relevant PR if you'd like to get a look at the code ahead of time. But otherwise, that should drop in release 0.7.3 coming up soon. Or 0.7.2, sorry.
So it's a little like
Awesome. Then Harvey, you want to talk about the next in-flight, the AWS account registration?
Yeah, this should be quick, more to solicit any feedback if that exists with this audience. So currently we're working on restoring our app mesh integration. And the first question we need to answer is, what is our approach for registering AWS account credentials with ServiceMeshHub? So later the solo team will meet and discuss some possible approaches. We're thinking about using the built-in EKS pod identity webhook as one method for enabling EKS clusters to talk to the AWS REST API. I'm curious if anyone in the crowd has any thoughts or opinions on how they would like to provide these credentials to ServiceMeshHub. Like other alternatives include simply giving us the secret key and the access key ID, and we can persist that in our system. But there are some security drawbacks with that approach.
That's right. We found that most people don't want to store that as a secret in Kubernetes and rely on roles in AWS and assuming certain roles when talking to the API.
I don't have a better idea for you guys, but I would say that I'm part of the crowd of people that didn't find that particularly of a good approach.
Yep.
Try that.
So would you prefer, the other model that we're looking at right now is using Amazon STS to directly inject the pod with a JOT that can be used to authenticate to AWS services.
Can you please repeat that? I'm not sure I quite understood.
Is Eitan on the call by any chance?
He's not, but that approach that we all took with Glue, that Eitan worked on, that is one that I suggested that we explore.
Yeah, it's basically the ability to create an IAM role associated with a service account in Kubernetes and then inject that directly to the pod. And then the pod can use that to build it as it's the basis of its credentials. So there's no need to create an access key, secret key that, store that as a secret. All of that is handled by Amazon.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think external DNS uses something like this as well to publish to Route 53.
That would be very helpful to look into. I'm not familiar with actually how they do it, but that would make sense.
So they use a IAM role that gets associated with the external DNS configurations, and then it uses that to publish to Route 53.
So we're discussing using something similar on our end.
One drawback to this approach, it may require ServiceMeshHub to be installed on an EKS provision cluster. There's a lot of magic that happens behind the scenes. I think the mutating webhook is not even run in the cluster. From the discussion on this issue, it sounds like it's running somewhere in the background. Curious what people's thoughts are on the feasibility of the approach given that limitation that ServiceMeshHub has to be installed on EKS.
Well, if it is installed on EKS, then we should definitely take advantage of that. If it's not, and we want, I think, in my opinion, we do want to make that an option, then we'll need, I don't know, we'll need some kind of agent or something, right? Running in the EKS cluster to do that.
Non-EKS cluster? Or?
So if we run ServiceMeshHub control plane or management plane in a non-EKS cluster, but we do want to, I guess that doesn't make any sense, right? So if we're trying to discover things in Amazon, then what I was thinking is we install an agent into EKS that then from there will discover the Amazon environment.
Yeah, they do have some instructions for installing these webhooks on a self-provisioned cluster, though. With Amazon.
But in Amazon, right?
No, it's just a completely manual cluster. There are instructions for installing a webhook. I haven't taken that for a test run though, so I'm not sure how difficult that is.
The way STS works is that you configure an OpenID provider that you trust, and then JOTs by that provider can be exchanged for an Amazon token. So there's nothing tying it specifically to EKS.
I see.
So potentially we can take that approach. It might mean more upfront setup for the user.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about.
Can we automate that?
What?
Can we automate the setup?
Maybe if we have credentials, but I think that the point is, I guess maybe in the command line, we can automate it if we have some user credentials.
Yeah.
So one thing unfortunately, I'm not that much of an expert on AWS credentials and whatnot, but I think one thing that would help a lot is, Harvey, if you listed some of the options, just, bullet list of some of the options you considered, because our team can draw on a number of people, including some of our IT groups who do this kind of thing for a living, to get some opinions. So if you put down some of the options at a summary level, we can maybe come back with some opinions or suggestions or some gotchas that we've uncovered. And as Mihai was mentioning with the Route 53, we've kind of done something along the lines of that already. So if you need a reference of that, we could throw it in the issue as well.
That sounds good. I'll link the issue once we create it with the input from the solo team, and I'll let you know.
Actually, I thought the issue is already, is it not the issue in the meeting notes?
Oh yeah, we have to populate that with some possible approaches after our discussion later today.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
Yeah, thank you very
So
much.
cool. Mihai, do you want to talk about the item you added?
Yeah, so should I share or will people look at it?
Sharing is fine.
Yeah, you
if
can
want.
share.
Yeah, let me make sure you can. You should be able to try. And let me know.
Okay, give me a second.
Perfect.
Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, so we've been having discussions regarding limited trust for some time now, and we'd like to get involved and first of all, we'd like to understand what is already possible in SMH to get limited trust working, and we'd like to get involved into getting a better approach on that if it's necessary. So we understand you guys did a proof of concept using Glue previously with limited trust, but it was my understanding that Glue is configured manually at that point, not through SMH. Is that a correct assumption?
I believe that was the case.
Okay. So from our point of view, it's not just about Glue, it's about getting workloads in different clusters to communicate with each other, but without actually having to change the root certificates in the clusters. Because I think that may be a problem, especially if there are two organizations involved in that exchange. That probably isn't something that's desirable in the long run. Do you guys agree with that statement, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be different trust domains that we need to bridge. Yes.
Okay, so one of the propositions we came up with, but we're eager to hear your opinions on this and what you guys have done, because you probably did more digging into this than us, was to use to configure the ingress gateways in each cluster as sort of an edge proxy where that does TLS termination from the request in a remote cluster, and then initiates another TLS connection to the service inside its own cluster. So basically the workload inside its cluster will have no idea about the trust domain of the service requester, but the edge proxy would still validate its certificates and make sure it is allowed to connect to the underlying service.
I think this is going down the path of making sure that the traffic is encrypted, but is there, what do we take into account the, representing the identity of the calling service?
Well, that's one of the problems, because we're not sure how we would pass down the identity to this one. We would definitely verify the identity in the proxy, so the proxy would know the identity, because we're envisioning this as an MTLS connection, not a simple TLS connection from the workload to the ingress gateway. but part of the issue would be how do we get the identity of the caller down to the requested service, but without actually informing the workload, the remote workload, about the trust domain and certificates, and not having to change that.
So I think there are two options here, right? One is that the edge proxy enforces the policy. You know, the edge proxy understands both identities, right? So it can enforce policy that says, you know, this service from that cluster can or cannot talk to another service in another cluster. The other option, which I like less, is that the proxy will have the ability to impersonate identities in the destination cluster and will generate an identity representing, you know, service A on the other cluster, essentially translate the identities. The problem is that you give a lot of power to a component that's on the edge, impersonating identities, so it's not really good security practice. Those are the options I thought about. I wonder if there's any other options other people think about.
So basically on option number one, from a ServiceMeshHub perspective, if we're writing policies about services in trust domain A can or cannot talk to services in trust domain B, that the enforcement point ends up at the proxy.
For cross-domain policy.
For cross-domain, right.
So at the workload proxy, you mean?
Not the workload proxy.
The
The
edge proxy?
because the workload proxy doesn't understand the originating identity.
Right.
And if the edge proxy has only its own edge certificate, all the workloads in the destination cluster will see the edge proxy as the source of traffic.
Right.
And yeah, and that's kind of what Mihai drew here.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
I was referring to that diagram, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, excuse my artist skills, they're not, they're non-existent.
So the edge proxy is the only one that has the client-side identity. It's not actually it's not actually available to the workload proxy.
That's option one. In option two, we can have the edge proxy, you know, be able to kind of impersonate a service and translate the identity, but I think that's giving a lot of power to the edge proxy. But those are the two options I thought about. And I'm curious too if there's any more options I didn't think about.
So the current glue, let me just get grounded here. The current glue implementation of this does more of the first form, or it doesn't even do MTLS from the client side?
I'll have to double check with Aidan. I think the first form, yeah. Aidan did the implementation. But it's along the line of the first option. That's what we thought about when we did it.
Okay, because it wasn't clear from the documentation if it even did MTLS from the client to the edge proxy or just TLS. It looked like it almost did TLS from the client to the edge proxy and then was impersonating the service is for the client and then impersonating the client for the end service.
I know there's no impersonation going on.
Right.
I'm not sure about MTLS versus TLS. I'll have to ask Aidan.
Okay.
We discussed the possibility of building an identity gateway that would, you know, enforce cross trust domain identity. Is that what you're describing as the first solution, Yuval?
Exactly, yes.
Do we need a special gateway for that?
Yeah, because it needs to enforce ServiceMeshHub policies. So we need to, you know, have that logic in the edge proxy.
Yeah. So I mean, so in that first scenario, the proxy will need to be driven by ServiceMeshHub, but
Yes.
does that need to be a custom? We don't have to write anything, right? We can still use Glue or Envoy or something for that.
Yeah. I don't think we need to add any code to Envoy. Just configure it with. It has RBAC filter that can do this sort of stuff.
Right. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. But yeah, definitely. So that, and I think that becomes the value of ServiceMeshHub in that scenario, which is I can write an RBAC or an access control policy between service 1 and service 2, and they may live in different trust domains, but under the covers, ServiceMeshHub is orchestrating the rules in the right spot, and in this case, the right spot would be the edge proxy, and that's where the enforcement will happen, not at the actual workloads that themselves, which is what happens in a service mesh running in a single trust domain, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
I think that makes sense.
So I'm hearing sort of proceed with option 1 for now, and at least kind of flesh it out more, provide a little more detail on it. But
I think this use case is probably when we talk about different trust domains and so forth, and different, that's not just trust domains, it's different identity protocols or representations, that this ends up becoming the more, if you have different trust domains and they're both using Istio, both using Spiffy, then having the different trust domains, you don't really have to translate identity per se. But in the worst case scenario is these are different trust domains and different identity representations. And that's where this solution helps solve that.
yeah, I think Mihai, you were proposing really just start with Istio, so you didn't have to.
Yeah.
You were just dealing with the trust domain issue, not the different identity format issue.
Exactly. My first concern was to get the connectivity working between trust domains, and so authentication first and then authorization, something like that, if that makes sense.
If it's just Istio, then an area that we might want to look at is in the Spiffy Federation. And so you can exchange trusted CAs with the different trust domains so that you can still go from a trust domain in A to a service running in trust domain B and still have the connection trusted end to end without having to do anything special at the edge proxy.
Christian, do you know if Istio supports Spiffy Federation?
So I looked in the code, and Istio, the proxies are able to call out to a bundle endpoint and pull down the key set, but Istio itself doesn't have an endpoint that exposes that. So
I looked a while ago, and I vaguely remember they were verifying a single trust domain. But yeah, maybe it's
the proxy verifies that, but the key exchange, I can send you the link, but it is able to look up from a trust domain bundle endpoint.
Yeah. What
are the trust domains and what are the appropriate certificates to go along with it? Let me find it.
Yeah, I think what Christian said is a summary of the conclusion we reached as well.
But like I said, Istio doesn't expose the endpoint, the bundle endpoint. But I mean, that would be a management plane or a management server would be a very appropriate spot to do that. So maybe another area to explore as part of this, if we're just assuming two Istios. But like I said,
Well,
the worst case
I'm-
scenario that we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier is not a bad one to solve also.
Yeah.
So the
I
reason,
think,
go ahead, John.
go ahead,
Sorry.
Mihai. No, you go. Go.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is that the reason we proposed Istio first is because we believe it's the simplest model to solve for in the first place and get our bearing straight with everything that's going on, and also with the SMH code, which we're not familiar with. And we definitely want to treat harder problems in the future. But this is like a first step into that direction. So we definitely don't want to limit this to Istio, from my point of view.
So and to that point, I think the big question then is, okay, what do we need to change the API, or is the API work as is when this is like Istio to Istio, or when we have to deal with translating the identity? So I think that in a way is the big question, because we don't want to kind of implement this only for Istio, find all the APIs work great, and then suddenly find when we have to translate, we're missing things. So I guess we just gave ourselves an action to do that evaluation.
So in that doc, once, I don't know, Golang is being ridiculous for me right now, but I can point you to the code in Istio that has some of the trust bundle stuff.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing in the meantime.
Cool. Double checking to see if there's anything else that's been added to our list here. Let's see. So no other topics outside of Scott just posted the post refactor code walkthroughs for the repository / code walkthrough for the discovery and the networking. So that's in here for folks to be able to see. But that's it on topics. Anything else? Anything else you want to bring up or have a question about today?
Oh, no, I missed like the first minute or so of audio. I guess all the refactor code is done, right, and released, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I knew we talked a lot about what was in there. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything pending, but that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so the link to the issues there, so you can see the full list of stuff, and then the Google Drive links are, Scott, if these are the things these are the ones that I looked at the other day, they're like recorded demos, right? Basically.
They're not demos. They're walkthroughs of the code base, essentially, and an overview.
Screen
of
share,
where to
yeah.
go. Yes, exactly, screen share. And I'm happy to do another session if maybe the Cisco people, anyone who's interested, wants to do like a live session. We can totally set that up.
Yeah, that might be very interesting. I think let us first actually go through what you already have, and then we can be more specific if there's areas. We could be more specific about what areas are the most confusing to us, or we have least understanding of. So that would be good.
Cool.
I think we're due to just on that last point, due to some PTO and stuff like that, we're probably at least 2 weeks out before we would request that, Scott. So maybe at the next community meeting, we'll decide on that, and if so, when, kind of thing at that 2 weeks out.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Then with that, we'll see folks in 2 weeks. And if for those going on PTO, have fun wherever you're off to.
Thank you.
All right. Talk to y'all later. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.